Hello and welcome to Drunk on Tea. Today, using just the contents for the new Introductory Starter Set for Age of Sigmar, I'm going to paint up a Stormcast Eternal. So here we have the contents to the Introductory Starter Set. So we've got some Khorne Red, Retributor Armour, Rakarth Flesh, Lead Belcher, Steel Legion Drab, and some Cantor Blue. As well as this, we've got a starter brush which I'll be using to paint the model, and we have the Stormcast Eternal they'll be painting up using just these paints. So as well as the contents to the starter set, I'm also using a pallet pad. This one's by Games Workshop, but you can just use plate or an old tile or something like that to use as a palette. As well as the palette, I've also got a pot of water. For this, it's just to rinse out brushes between paints. And finally, I've got some paper towel here. This is for drying off my brushes between paints and also for doing some dry brushing later on. So now first of all, I'm going to come in with some Retributor Armour. I'm going to take this out of the pot, putting it onto my palette here, getting a nice amount onto my palette, and then using a little bit of water from my water pot, I'm going to thin the paint down. So I want to do this so it runs nice and smoothly off of the brush, but isn't so wet that it runs away from you. And now, with that nicely thinned paint, I'm going to start applying this all over the model. So I'm going to use the Retributor Armour here as both an undercoat and a base coat for the model. Now as you move on in your painting journey, you'll be using spray primers quite a lot for priming your models, but as there's none of that in this set, I'm just going to paint all of the model with some Retributor Armour. As you can see, the coverage isn't great, it's very patchy and a lot of plastic is still showing through. This is common, so what you'll want to do is build up slowly over a couple of layers until we get a solid gold colour all over the model. Make sure you work this paint into all of the recesses, all of the crevices, every detail of the model, so there'll be no bare plastic showing. As you can see, after the first coat, it's very patchy, there's still quite a lot of plastic visible. So now I'm going to come back in with a second coat, thinned down exactly the same, and slowly build up until I get that solid coat all over the Stormcast Eternal. This may take 3 or even 4 coats of Retributor Armour until we get that solid coverage, but don't worry about how long it takes, just let each layer dry fully between applying and slowly build up until we get a solid gold colour all over the model. And make sure you're checking into all of the creases and crevices to the model. You can see here around his neck, there's some parts of bare plastic still showing, so I'm going to make sure I catch that area, especially with the next layer. So by the time I've applied 3 or 4 coats of Retributor Armour, there'll be absolutely no bare plastic showing on the model. And after those couple of coats, you can see I've built up to that solid coverage all over the Stormcast Eternal. So now it's time to create a shade for this model. So for this, I'm coming in with some Khorne Red and Retributor Armour. Now I only want a little bit of Khorne Red, so it's about a 1 to 3 mix. So I'm going to take a little bit of Khorne Red, apply it here on my palette. Now I'm going to dry off my brush so I don't contaminate the paint. Now I'm going to apply about 3 times as much Retributor Armour onto my palette. So we'll use the Khorne Red to darken down the Retributor Armour. But we don't want to make it pure red, so I still want an awful lot of gold in there. I'm going to mix these 2 colours together until they're fully mixed, and now I start thinning them down with a lot of water so it becomes a really watery paint that will flow into all of the recesses of the model. So keep adding water way past the level we thinned down the pure Retributor Armour. This will create what we often call a shade paint. Games Workshop sells paints like Known Oil and Agrax Earthshade, which are fantastic for these kinds of jobs. We don't have any in that introductory starter set. Got to make my own. I'm going to do this by mixing paints and thinning them down. You can see how much water I'm adding here. Finally, it's flowing really smoothly off of my brush. So now I'm going to apply this all over the areas of the model that I want to finish off being that goldy colour. So it's going to be all of the armour and all of the golden details. I'm not worried about getting this over areas I'm going to paint with different colours later on. For now, make sure you apply a coat of this all over those areas that we want to be gold, and it will sink into those recesses, darken them down, and allow us to highlight and add interest to the model. So you can see after applying that shade, it has sunk into those recesses, darkened down the creases, as well as adding sort of reddy tone all over the gold. So now it's time to apply a little bit of a highlight to the gold. For this, I'm coming in with some lead belcher. I'm going to do a technique called dry brushing. So I'm going to take some of the lead belcher onto my brush, and rather than applying it to a palette, I'm going to work it into the bristles of the paintbrush using a paper towel. You want to keep doing this until hardly any paint is coming off of your brush, just the finest fleck of silver. And then once you've got to that desired result, I'm going to flick the brush over the model. What this will do is leave tiny deposits of silver just on the most raised edges to all the details. This will give a nice highlight effect all over that gold, making it look like the light is catching all of the raised surfaces, but leaving just that pure gold colour in all the flat areas, and our shaded one in all of the recesses. So just very lightly flick your brush back and forth over the model, leaving small amounts of lead belcher on all of the raised details to the model. You don't want to come too heavy at this stage. Less is more, and it's easier to add more silver if we need than it would be to try and take it away if we come too heavy with this dry brush. So just keep flicking all over the model till you build up to an amount you're happy with of silver on all of the raised details. And with that dry brush of silver applied, you can see how it's highlighted all of the edges to all the panels of the armour. So the next thing is I'm going to paint some pure lead belcher over areas that I want to be silver. So for this I'm coming in with lead belcher again, but now I'm going to apply it to my palette, much like I did with the Retributor armour first. And I'm going to thin it down with just a little bit of water, so it runs nice and smoothly off of my brush, without being too thick. And now with the thinned down paint, I'm going to apply this over areas here like the scale mail, being really careful around all of the areas that I want to be silver. Just going to very carefully apply some of this lead belcher over the areas of scale mail. Once again, this may take a couple of coats until we get a solid coat. Let the first one dry and come back through with some more lead belcher. I'm also applying this to the hammer that he's holding in his hands. I'm going to be careful around this symbol here in the middle of the hammer, trying to keep that silver, but painting the rest of the flatter parts to the hammer with a couple of layers of lead belcher as well. I'm going to paint the top part leading up to the head with lead belcher too. And after a couple of coats of lead belcher, you can see we've got a solid coverage over all of those areas that we want to be silver. So now it's going to be time to shade those silver areas. For this, I'm using corn red and lead belcher, much like I did with the gold. I'm going to apply just a little bit of the corn red onto my palette. Use this to darken down that silver colour. And now I'm going to put about 3 or 4 times as many drops of lead belcher as I did for the corn red. So it's a mostly lead belcher mix with a little bit of corn red just to darken it down. Once again, mix these two colours together and then keep adding water till it's got that really smooth flowing consistency of the shade like we created earlier. So keep adding water till it flows really smoothly and will sink into all of the recesses. We've got ourselves a nice dark, slightly reddy silver shade. And now with this, for certain lines like this, I'm going to be a little bit careful with where I apply it. I'm going to do what's called a pin shade, where I'm just applying it into the recesses. So it doesn't stain the rest of the metallic details, but it will sink into all of those recesses, darkening those areas down and adding some shadow and darkness into the recesses. So make sure you pin shade all of the details on the hammer and the scale mail.
If you're enjoying the video, please press like. If you want more videos, press the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. If you would like to support the channel and become a member, please press the join button down below.
And after that homemade shade has dried, you can see how it's sunk into those recesses of all of the silver details and added that reddy shade and a little bit of darkness into those recesses. So now I'm coming in with some Cantor blue. And once again, I'm applying some of this onto my palette. And I'm just going to thin this down with a really small amount of water, just so it flows nice and smoothly off of my brush, as we should do with all of our base paints. And now I'm going to carefully apply this to the areas I want to be blue. So it's going to be the shield and the shoulder pads. Now I'm carefully working this around the areas we've already painted and highlighted with the Retributor armor and then the silver dry brush. But if you do make any mistakes at this stage, you can paint these back over with a little bit of Retributor armor just to tidy up at the end. But try and paint all of the face of the shield, leaving that detail in the middle as the golden colour. So really take your time at this stage, work nice and slowly, paint a nice flat layer of Cantor blue all over the flat details to the shield. So this will probably take a couple of coats to build up to that solid coverage. Just take your time, slowly build up that colour until we get a smooth blue colour all over the shield. As you can see here, I'm also doing the same onto the shoulder pads. So I'm going to leave the detailing in the middle and the trim at the top. I'm going to make sure I catch the rest of the shoulder with a couple of layers of Cantor blue. On the other shoulder pad, I'm going to leave that lightning strike in the middle and the trim at the top, but once again making sure I cover all of the rest of the pad with a couple of layers of blue. And at this stage as well, I'm also just going to pick out the scabbard to the sword as well, making sure to leave all of the detail in gold. Just apply a couple of layers to the scabbard as well. And after a couple of layers, you see I've got a smooth cover of Cantor blue all over those details. Next thing I'm going to pick out some of the strappings. So I'm doing this with corn red. So once again, I'm taking some of this, applying it onto my palette. I'm going to thin this down, just a little bit of water once again, just so it flows nice and smoothly. For this, I'm just going to pick out the strapping details on the handle to the hammer and the handle to the sword as well. So be nice and careful around all the other colours we've already painted. Make sure you catch these with some corn red. I'm also going to carefully pick out any of the gems in the middle of any of the details as well. So there's quite a few dotted around the model. Just carefully pick these out with a little bit of corn red. So with all the strapping and the gems picked out, the next thing I'm going to base coat is any details of undersuit. So for this, I'm using Steel Legion Drab. Once again, applying a little bit to my palette, and thinning it down with a bit of water so it runs nice and smoothly. And now I'm going to pick out detailing like the belt, undersuit, and any of the straps holding armor plates on. So carefully pick these out with a couple of layers of Steel Legion drab, being careful not to get these over any of the gold details or anything else we've already painted. Make sure you pick out all of the straps. So it's got that belt that we've just picked out. There's this one on the inside of his shield as well. And also you'll see in several points there are airs of fabric showing through between the panels of the armor. So I'm going to pick out all of this undersuit with a couple of layers of Steel Legion drab as well. Obviously being really careful around all the panels, we want to remain gold, but between all of those I'm applying a couple of layers of Steel Legion drab, but I get a solid light brown colour to all of these areas of undersuit. Make sure you take your time, work your way around the model, picking all of these out. There are some underneath the arms as well as on the back of the legs. Just make sure you catch all of these with some Steel Legion drab. And once that Steel Legion drab's applied, that is all of the undersuit and strapping details picked out on the models. So now we're going to shade some of those details. So once again, I'm coming in with corn red and mixing it with some Steel Legion drab. I'm coming in with quite a lot of Steel Legion drab first. So this will be about a 3-to-1 mix again. So applying the Steel Legion drab onto my palette. Washing my brush off and then grabbing a little bit of corn red just to darken down that Steel Legion drab and mixing the two colours together once again. So thin this down with a lot of water so it flows really smoothly. As I will say, the lack of shade paints is the only thing I really miss from this introductory starter set. A Nuln Oil or Agrax Earthshade would really make the set so great for everyone getting into the hobby, but you can get similar effects by mixing paints. So once we've got this to a really watery consistency so it flows really smoothly, I'm now going to apply a little bit of this mix all over the areas we just painted with Steel Legion drab. So this will sink into all of those recesses again, adding some definition to these areas of brown, helping us to achieve both shadows and highlights once we come to our later steps. So once that shade paint has dried, you can see how it's darkened down all of those recesses. So now it's time to apply some highlights. First one of these highlights I'm applying is some Rakarth Flesh mixed with some Cantor Blue. So take about a 50-50 mix of the two colours, mix them together on my palette, and unlike before, I'm not going to make a shade paint here, I'm just applying a little bit of water so these paints flow nice and smoothly off of my brush. And with the new brighter blue, I'm going to apply what's called an edge highlight to all of the blue details. So you can see the top of the shield here where we've got a sharp edge. I'm applying a thin line of this blue mix as a highlight going around all of these sharp edges. This will give the impression of light catching on all these sharper edges. It really adds interest and helps make these details on the model stand out. So I'm just applying a thin edge highlight of this blue mix to all the areas we paint with Cantor Blue. And with the edge highlight applied, you can see how it has added interest and made all of those areas stand out on the model. So now we'll do the same with the red. Once again, mixing a little bit of Rakarth Flesh into my corn red. About 50-50 mix again. Mixing the two colours together so we get a nice lighter red colour. Thinning it down with just a little bit of water so it flows nice and smoothly off of my brush. Getting a nice point to my brush as well, so that I can just catch the raised details that are sculpted into this strapping on the weapon handles. So I'm just catching the raised parts with quick sweeping motions to highlight the red. And with the corn red highlighted, the next thing to highlight is going to be the brown. For this, I'm coming in with pure Steel Legion Drab first. So I'm going to take this onto my palette once again, thin it down with just a little bit of water so it flows nice and smoothly. And now I'm going to apply this wherever we're on large flat areas that the shade that we created didn't settle into the recesses. So what this will do is return these areas back to their original colour, brightening them up if the shade darkened it down at all. So I'm just applying this on all of the raised areas, leaving that darkened down colour in all of the recesses. So this step will take a little while, but take your time, make sure you catch all of the raised areas of Steel Legion Drab with a coat of pure Steel Legion Drab. And with that done, you can see how it's brightened up those areas. So now I'm coming in with some pure Rawk flesh. I'm going to use this as a highlight. So take a little bit of this paint, applying it on my palette once again, thinning it down with just a little bit of water so it flows nice and smoothly and isn't chalky or lumpy at all. I'm going to twist my brush so I get a real fine point and tip to my paintbrush, and now all the areas Steel Legion Drab, much like with the blue, just applying a thin edge highlight at the very edges on all the raised details. So keep these lines nice and thin, but just apply an edge highlight of Rawk flesh to all of the areas that we painted with Steel Legion Drab. So on the belt here you can see how I'm picking out just the very sharpest edges, leaving the brown showing in the middle. And then on the areas here of undersuit, I'm just picking out the tops of any of these raised folds and creases. So where we came through and applied the Steel Legion Drab before, this creates a really nice highlighted effect. We've got the shade in the recess, got the larger flatter areas at their base colour, and then this highlight, the very tips of all the sharpest points, really adds interest to the model. And with that Rawk flesh highlight applied, that is the model painted, but there is one final step left to apply, and that's with some Steel Legion Drab again. I'm going to paint this onto the base, so I'm going to be really careful around the feet to the model. Don't want to get any Steel Legion Drab over the feet, and I'm also going to be careful around the rim to the base as well, because there's no black in the set, and I personally like black rims on my bases. So I'm just going to paint the flat top surface of the base with a couple of layers of Steel Legion Drab. It is going to take a couple of layers to build up to a solid coat, but when you do, you can see we've got a nice smooth coat of Steel Legion Drab on the top of that base and a nice clean black rim. That is how to paint the Stormcast Eternal from the Age of Sigmar Introductory Starter Set. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please let me know in the comments down below, are there any other Age of Sigmar models you would like to see me paint? But thank you very much for watching, and happy painting!